She was 8 months pregnant, unmarried, and walked into a town that greeted her with silence sharp as broken glass. They whispered shame behind her back and painted sinner across her schoolhouse in red. But she opened the door anyway, every single morning. And just when the mob came to cast her out, a man no one expected stepped forward. Grizzled, quiet, a former Confederate soldier who'd seen what hate can do. He didn't speak much, but when he did, the town listened. They called it Redemption Ridge, but for Mary Beth Taylor, it felt more like exile. The train wheezed to a stop with the sound of old metal sighing, its iron wheels trailing off into silence. She stepped down onto the cracked wooden platform with a battered leather suitcase in one hand and a small bundle of schoolbooks in the other. Her belly, round and unmistakably full, pushed against the seams of her coat. Her shoes were clean but worn. Her dress was pressed but not new. Every stitch said, "I prepared for this." Every eye on the platform replied, "You shouldn't have come." A wind swept down the street like it had something to prove, lifting dust into little tempests that scuttled between storefronts. It tugged at her hem and scarf, revealing the delicate curve of her pregnancy. A man in a long overcoat glanced up from loading barrels and then quickly looked away. A child stared until his mother pulled him close, whispering something low and sharp. Mary Beth took a breath, slow and careful. She wasn't here to argue or apologize. She was here because the town council had sent for a teacher. She had a letter signed in ink and stamped with a wax seal. She had lesson plans, reading primers, and ink pots wrapped in wool. She had everything but welcome. The first sign was subtle. No one offered to carry her bag. The station master nodded stiffly and turned back to his ledger. She walked the 3 blocks to the boarding house in silence, her boots thudding against the frost-bitten earth. Behind closed shutters, she felt the town watching. At the boarding house, the landlady, Mrs. Ellison, squinted at her over a pair of spectacles. Her lips flattened into something between a question and a scold. "You're the schoolteacher?" Mary Beth nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mary Beth Taylor." A long pause. Mrs. Ellison sniffed. "Third room on the right, shared wash basin, no gentlemen callers." Mary Beth's voice didn't flinch. "I'm not expecting any." Another pause, longer. Then a single key placed on the counter. The room was small but clean. The bed sagged slightly in the middle. There was a single chair by the window, a narrow desk, and a threadbare curtain that barely kept the light out. She unpacked in silence. Books on the desk, nightgown folded neatly under the pillow, a framed photograph of her mother placed gently on the sill. That evening, she walked to the schoolhouse to see what she was working with. It stood at the edge of town, half-shadowed by a row of bare cottonwoods. The white paint had flaked to gray, the windows streaked with grime. A rusted bell sat above the door, silent and still. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with chalk dust and disuse. Desks sat crooked, some with broken legs. Cobwebs traced the corners like old regrets. She knelt down and tested the floorboards with her palm. Solid, mostly. She ran a hand along the blackboard. Her fingers came away white. She could work with this. The next morning, she rose early. The air was colder than the night before. She boiled water on the stove in the boarding house kitchen and carried it in a mason jar wrapped in a towel to warm her fingers as she walked. Her breath rose in clouds. The sunrise cracked across the horizon like the shell of an egg, pink, bruised, and reluctant. Outside the schoolhouse, she paused, key in hand. Her reflection stared back from the frosted glass. Tired, pregnant, defiant, she opened the door and got to work. She swept the floor until her shoulders ached. She scrubbed the desks, straightened the chairs, dusted the shelves. She found a small tin of dried flowers in a drawer, someone's long-forgotten decoration, and placed it on the teacher's desk. She took a piece of chalk and wrote her name on the board in a firm, careful hand, Miss Taylor, and then she waited. The bell she rang echoed like a dare. The benches stayed empty. She sat at the front of the room with her hands folded over her belly, trying not to feel the stillness pressing in around her. No one came. At noon, she read aloud anyway, the legend of Sleepy Hollow, her voice calm and clear in the empty room. When she returned to the boarding house that evening, Mrs. Ellison said nothing. The next day, the same. On the third day, she found a note pinned to the schoolhouse door. No name, no signature. Just 4 words scrawled in shaky black ink. Go back to shame. She didn't cry. She folded the note, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked inside. On the 4th morning, as she unlocked the door with numb fingers, she heard hesitant footsteps behind her. A boy stood there, thin, brown-haired, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. He held a tattered notebook to his chest. "Ma says I can learn," he mumbled. "If that's still all right." Mary Beth opened the door wider and nodded. "It's more than all right, Henry. Come on in." Inside, she handed him a fresh pencil and sat him by the stove. She began the lesson like it was the most natural thing in the world. That night, she returned to the schoolhouse for a forgotten scarf. What she found instead was red paint. Someone had scrawled "Sinner" across the door in thick, dripping letters. She stood for a long moment, unmoving, her breath fogging up in front of her. Then, without a word, she fetched a bucket, some lye soap, and a stiff-bristled brush. Her hands turned raw as she scrubbed. The paint clung, stubborn and slick, but she didn't stop. She scrubbed until the boards splintered and her knuckles bled. Only when the last traces of the word were gone did she finally step back. The stars above her were cold and distant, but she stood tall beneath them, and Redemption Ridge, for all its judgment, did not make her bow. The days moved slow as syrup through a cracked tin. Redemption Ridge didn't speak her name, but it spoke about her, behind curtains, over laundry lines and murmurs exchanged at the butcher's block. Mary Beth felt it in the way Mrs. Whitcomb paused at the post office when their eyes met, clutching her lace-trimmed Bible like a talisman. She felt it when Reverend Slater avoided her on the boardwalk, crossing the street with exaggerated courtesy. She felt it in the silence at the general store, not the silence of forgetfulness, but the practiced kind, the kind carved intentionally around one person. Still, each morning, she rose before the sun and walked the frostbitten path to the schoolhouse. She unlocked the door, with fingers wrapped in gloves worn thin at the tips. The iron stove resisted the first match, coughed at the second, then roared grudgingly to life. She let it warm the room as she placed small, hopeful things where children ought to sit. A sharpened pencil here, a clean slate there. She arranged the books by subject and difficulty, labels handwritten with care. The first day after Henry came, she prepared 2 lunches. He didn't speak much, just copied every word she wrote, his tongue peeking out between his lips in concentration. He read aloud when asked. She praised him without embellishment. No reward beyond dignity. The next morning, a girl appeared. Millie. No knock, no fanfare. Just a quiet arrival. Her dress was patched at the knees, and she wore 1 mitten and 1 sock on her hands. Mary Beth didn't ask where the other one went. She simply smiled, gestured to a chair, and slid a copy of Little House in the Big Woods across the desk. 2 became 3 the day after. Jacob stood in the doorway, face pinched like he was expecting a blow. He didn't want a book, he wanted a reason to stay. Mary Beth gave him the alphabet in chalk, said nothing when he erased it 3 times in frustration. Sarah came last, small, with a soft voice that broke on every 3rd word. She couldn't pronounce her R's. Mary Beth didn't correct her. She let Sarah read The Wind in the Willows at her own pace, letting her stumble. The girl's fingers were always ink-stained, but she gripped the pen like she knew what it meant to hold on. 4 children, that was all, but it was enough. Each morning, she found something new waiting on the steps. A clean apple, a note without a name, "Thank you, Miss Taylor." A ball of red yarn. She didn't ask where these came from, but she noticed. She also noticed the scratches on the fence posts where the latch had been tightened, the pile of chopped wood that hadn't been there the day before. The schoolhouse door no longer groaned on its hinges. She spotted him once, Caleb Boone, out by the edge of the yard. Just standing, arms crossed, a hammer in one hand. He didn't wave, she didn't call out. But their eyes met. She gave a small nod. He returned it. No more. No less. And that night, after she cleaned the slates and swept the floor, she stepped outside into the dark and stopped short. The word was waiting again. Sinner. Painted in fresh red strokes, dripping like a wound reopened. Only this time, it was bigger. Bolder. Lettered across the schoolhouse wall, not the door. Not something that could be washed away with a rag and willpower. It had soaked into the wood, into the structure. Mary Beth stared at it for a long time. The cold numbed her hands, but not her thoughts. She went inside. She pulled out a ledger, the same one the former schoolmaster had used to mark attendance. On the inside cover, she wrote one line: "This building belongs to children, not to cowards." Then she shut the book, turned down the lantern, and locked the door behind her. She would deal with the wall in the morning. Tonight, she would sleep. Not in defeat, but in defiance. Because the word they painted didn't scare her. She had already survived what they hadn't dared to imagine. The notice went up on a Tuesday morning. Tacked to the church bulletin board, the words were stamped in clean type from the mayor's desk. A special meeting of concerned citizens, Wednesday, 7:00 p.m., Fellowship Hall. No mention of Mary Beth, no explanation. But the implication hung in the air like smoke from a chimney fire, sharp, bitter, impossible to ignore. That whole day, the town hummed with it. In the general store, conversations dropped to a hush whenever she walked in. Mrs. Ellison at the boarding house tightened her jaw and didn't mention supper. Children whispered behind their slates at school. Even little Henry looked unsure when he handed her a folded quiz. She smoothed his hair and told him, simply, "I'll be here tomorrow." The church bell tolled 7 times the next evening, each chime hitting like a slow hammer to the ribs. Mary Beth stood outside the fellowship hall, her breath forming ghosts in the icy air. She wore her plainest dress, navy wool with a faded white collar. Her hands were folded over her stomach, not out of shame but protection. The child stirred once beneath her palm, then settled again, as if it too was listening. Inside, the pews were already full. They'd come early. Men in pressed coats and starched collars. Women in shawls and hard eyes. The Reverend sat near the front, hands steepled, face unreadable. The mayor stood behind a makeshift podium, his spectacles catching the gaslight, his mouth set in an expression somewhere between concern and calculation. Mary Beth stepped in alone. Silence followed her like a ripple on still water. She walked with quiet purpose down the aisle and stood at the back, not asking for a seat. She didn't need one. Mayor Whitcomb cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the wooden rafters. "We've gathered here not out of malice, but responsibility." He looked around the room, drawing strength from every nod. "There's been concern regarding the moral example being set for our children. A woman in her condition." He paused, giving the phrase room to breathe. "Unwed, alone. Teaching boys and girls in a public building, paid for by the tax dollars of this town." Someone muttered, "Shameful." A few heads nodded. Others avoided her gaze. Whitcomb continued, voice smoother now. "This isn't about cruelty. It's about decency, about standards, about what kind of place we want Redemption Ridge to be." Mary Beth took a step forward. "I was hired because your last schoolteacher moved east," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You needed someone. I came. I've taught your children every day. I've asked for nothing but the chance to do my job." A woman in the second row, Mrs. Whitcomb, clutched her prayer book tightly. "You may teach them to read," she said, voice clipped. "But what are they learning by watching you?" A low murmur of agreement. Mary Beth drew breath, steady and deep. "They're learning that people can fall and still stand back up," she said. "They're learning that knowledge doesn't come with a pedigree or a ring on a finger. That worth isn't earned by whispers but by action." The room shifted, uneasy. The mayor opened his mouth, but someone else beat him to it. "Enough." The word cracked across the room like a rifle shot. Everyone turned. He stood in the back, tall, gray, still as a statue. Caleb Boone. Most hadn't heard his voice in years. Some of the children didn't even know who he was, just a name whispered by fathers at the saloon. Confederate, soldier, kept to himself. Dangerous, maybe. His coat, once gray military wool, was patched at the shoulders. His beard was trimmed but uneven, but it was his eyes, steel blue and unblinking, that quieted the room. "I've seen what hate does," he said, slow and level. "I've watched it eat through men like cancer, turn good boys into butchers, burn towns to ash and leave nothing but ghosts behind." He stepped forward. "You want to talk about decency?" His gaze swept the room. "Then look close. Because the woman standing here, the one you'd throw out into the snow, she's been more decent than most of you put together." The mayor sputtered. "Mr. Boone, this is exactly why I left the world behind," Caleb said, voice rising just a fraction. "Because I've seen what a mob can do. I've seen it with torches, with laws, and I see it again here, now, dressed up in ribbons and church clothes." He turned to Mary Beth, then, for the first time, really looked at her. Not as a curiosity, or a cause, but as someone who had held her ground when no one else would. "She's done nothing wrong, and I won't let you cast her out." Silence. Deep and bottomless. It was not agreement. Not yet. But it was hesitation. And in towns like Redemption Ridge, hesitation was the first sign of change. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. The Reverend rubbed his jaw and said nothing. Mary Beth said nothing either, because she didn't need to. Caleb Boone had spoken, and for the first time since she stepped off the train, she wasn't standing alone. The day after the meeting, the sky turned the color of hammered lead. Thick clouds rolled in low and unmoving, as if watching from above. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the whole town braced for it, not just in the weather, but in the air between people. Mary Beth walked to the schoolhouse the same way she always did. Steady, unsmiling, coat buttoned tight, scarf pinned at the collarbone like armor. No one stopped her, no one helped her, but something had shifted. They no longer looked away. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had softened. No longer knives, more like paper. Mrs. Ellison didn't say good morning, but she left hot coffee on the stove when Mary Beth came down. At the general store, the clerk who used to let her count out coins now slid the ledger toward her without comment. There was no apology, no recognition, just a faint, reluctant space being cleared around her, as if the town were waiting to see if she would stay. She did. The schoolhouse became her rhythm. Each day began before dawn. She arrived before the children and swept the floor again, even when it didn't need it. She adjusted chairs no one touched, and lit the stove with slow hands, always watching the flame catch like breath after grief. The scent of dry wood and chalk dust filled the room before the sun had fully broken, and the children came. Not many. Still just Henry, Millie, Jacob, Sarah, 4 small islands in a sea of suspicion. But they came faithfully, pulling off wet boots by the door, laying mittens on the radiator to dry, speaking softer than children normally did. They never asked about the town, never spoke of the meeting, but they brought her things: a biscuit wrapped in wax paper, a small tin of lard, a sprig of rosemary for the windowsill. The 5th day after the meeting, she noticed the fence. The boards no longer sagged. Someone had braced them overnight with fresh pine. The nails were driven in clean, not by a novice, but by a man who had built things that needed to hold in storms. She didn't ask. The next morning she found the woodpile stacked higher than she remembered. Pine and oak, chopped fine, no bark. Beside it sat a small bundle of kindling wrapped in twine. She didn't ask. Then one afternoon, while erasing the board after the children left, she heard a creak outside the window. She looked up. There he was. Caleb Boone. Standing just beyond the yard, coat pulled tight, gloves in one hand, a hammer hanging at his side. He wasn't watching the schoolhouse, he was watching her. But not with curiosity, not with charity, with something quieter, resembling responsibility. She met his gaze and nodded once. He returned it. Then he turned and walked off, boots crunching softly in the snow-dusted grass. It became a pattern. He never crossed the threshold. But every day, sometime between lunch and dismissal, he appeared at the edge of the yard, sometimes repairing a shutter, sometimes splitting logs. Once he replaced the broken latch on the outhouse without a word. The children began to glance at him, whispering, "That's the soldier." But no one asked questions. And Mary Beth let it happen. She didn't offer thanks. She didn't bake him bread or send a note. But one morning, she left a clean kerchief folded over a warm biscuit on the fence post. The next day, the biscuit was gone. In its place, a jar of preserved peaches with a faded label. August 1869. That was how they spoke. Winter closed in around the town like a tightening fist. Snow came in sheets, burying fences, slowing wagons, covering every path. But the schoolhouse stayed warm. Its stove never went cold. And in the corner of the room, a sprig of rosemary stayed green against the frost-streaked window. Mary Beth sat at her desk most nights after the children left, fingers wrapped around a chipped teacup, reading by lamplight. She wasn't waiting, but she wasn't alone anymore either. Because sometimes dignity doesn't march in with a speech. Sometimes it watches from the fence. And sometimes that's enough to survive the winter. The storm began without thunder. It arrived the way old grief does, slow, gray, and impossible to ignore. A low wind rolled through Redemption Ridge the morning of December 17th, pressing down like a warning. By noon, the clouds had turned a dirty slate, dragging their weight low enough to kiss the rooftops. Townsfolk moved quicker than usual. Boots echoed sharper against the planks of the boardwalk. The blacksmith shut early. Even the Reverend cut short his Wednesday sermon and sent the faithful home before the second hymn. Mary Beth stood at the schoolhouse window, watching the sky like a woman reading an omen. Her belly had dropped 2 inches in the past week, the ache in her lower back now a constant whisper. Every breath felt shorter, every step heavier. She didn't speak of it. There was no one to tell. The children had gone home early. The parents had insisted. Millie's father had knocked on the door with unusual politeness. eyes flickering to Mary Beth's stomach, then quickly away. "Big storm coming. You should get in early, Miss Taylor." She nodded, thanked him, and stayed. She cleaned the slates with more force than needed. She set a fresh fire. She arranged the readers by alphabetical order. Anything to move, to delay, to resist the stillness settling into her bones. At dusk, snow began to fall, not gentle flakes but heavy wet clumps that dropped straight down like stones. The wind, having waited patiently, now screamed between buildings. It rattled shutters and flung itself against windows with wild hands. She wrapped her scarf twice around her throat and stepped outside, one gloved hand on her stomach, the other clutching her coat closed. The walk to the boarding house wasn't far, 4 blocks, maybe 5, but the cold sliced through fabric like it had a purpose. Halfway down Main Street, the first pain hit. It wasn't sharp, not yet. It was a deep pull, a muscle folding inward. She stopped, waited, breathed. Then another, longer, deeper. She knew the rhythm. She'd read the books, taught the lessons in anatomy, but knowing and feeling were oceans apart. She turned around, not toward the boarding house, but toward the doctor's cottage on Birch Lane. She would not be a burden to strangers. She would not scream in a rented bed and wake Mrs. Ellison's tenants. She would not ask anyone for help unless she had to. The next contraction drove her to her knees. Snow soaked through her stockings in seconds. The lantern lights in town blurred at the edges. She pushed herself upright, staggered forward 5 paces, then fell again. That was when she saw boots. She blinked, disoriented. The world swayed. The boots moved toward her, big, worn, dusted with snow, and familiar. She tried to speak. Everything went black. She woke to heat. Not the brittle warmth of the schoolhouse stove, but rich, living warmth, the kind that comes from fire and effort and care. Her eyes fluttered open. She was lying on a mattress draped in worn quilts, her boots removed, her coat peeled off and drying beside the hearth. Her back ached, her fingers tingled, and beside her sat Caleb Boone, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from sweat and snow, his shirt stained at the shoulder. Her hand was in his, firm, grounded. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking toward the door where a woman knelt beside a steaming basin. The midwife. Mary Beth blinked again. A cry pierced the air. Thin, fierce, alive. The midwife turned, bundled in her arms a red-faced, furious newborn wrapped in Caleb's coat. "You passed out in the snow," the midwife said without ceremony. "He carried you 2 miles. Mary Beth's voice cracked. "Through the storm?" "Wouldn't stop for the mule," the woman muttered, her hands busy, voice gruff with admiration. "Wrapped you in his own coat. Said, 'She's too light. Wind'll take her.'" The child cried louder. Caleb stood and crossed the room without a word. He moved like a man who had worked through pain before, not hurried, but precise. He took the baby into his arms as if he'd done it before in another life. The infant quieted, as if even she understood that something sacred had just shifted. Mary Beth reached out. Caleb bent, gently placed the baby in her arms. The weight, the heat, the smell, milk and skin and something ancient, hit her all at once. She didn't weep, not yet. The tears would come later. Now she just breathed. The child's fingers curled against her chest, her heart pounded in her throat. "She's strong," Mary Beth whispered. Caleb nodded, like her mother. Those were the first words he'd spoken to her directly. He turned away then, busying himself at the hearth. He added a log to the fire. The wind outside rattled the shutters again, but inside the cabin all was still. The midwife finished her work and gave Mary Beth a thin smile. "She'll do fine now, you both will." She packed her satchel and left them there, a woman, a child, and a man who hadn't meant to become anything more than a bystander. Mary Beth sat back, the infant asleep now against her breast. The firelight flickered across the log beams. On a nearby shelf sat a row of glass jars, preserves, pickles, root vegetables. Beside them, a wooden box, carved initials. CB. This was not a house made for guests. It was a house made for solitude. And yet, here she was. She glanced at Caleb. He had settled into the chair across from her, not watching her, but not looking away either. Just there, steady, present. The wind screamed once more, but neither of them flinched. Because in the middle of the storm, a girl had been born. And something else had taken root, fragile, wordless, but real. Not love, not yet, but a beginning. Redemption Ridge had always lived on whispers. It wasn't a town that shouted. It didn't throw rocks or stage protests. It didn't tar and feather. But it remembered, and it watched. Judgments here came not as sentences, but as silences. And silences could starve a person to death just as surely as hunger. So, when news spread that Mary Beth Taylor had given birth in Caleb Boone's cabin, not the boarding house, not the doctor's office, but his cabin, the town didn't riot. It simmered. At Baker's General, Mrs. Langley let the scales tip heavy on Mary Beth's flour ration, and said nothing. But the moment she left, 2 other women leaned across the counter, their voices low and pinched. Why was he the one to find her? Doesn't seem proper, a man like that. She's got him wrapped around her finger now, you watch. The preacher's wife told her neighbor that they should start praying for the child, not in judgment, in case the child turned out all right. But still, the prayer list was an index of public concern, not compassion. At the barber shop, the men talked in circles. One said Caleb was soft now, a man who'd buried his gun and picked up a cradle. Another reminded them all what Caleb had done during the war. You think a man who held the Shenandoah line is going to fold under some town gossip? No one dared say it out loud, but every conversation landed in the same unspoken place. Caleb Boone had chosen to stand beside Mary Beth Taylor, and no one, not even the mayor, had dared stop him. That made people nervous. It also made them curious. The first sign of change came on the 3rd day after the birth. A single basket appeared outside the schoolhouse door. Inside, a small quilt, hand-stitched, initials embroidered in one corner. MT. No note, no explanation. Mary Beth said nothing. She folded it into her satchel and began her lesson with the same clear voice as always. The next morning, there were 6 children, then 8. Sarah brought a friend, her cousin, who didn't speak but stared in awe at the baby girl sleeping in the makeshift cradle beside the stove. Henry offered to stay after class and chop kindling for the stove. When Mary Beth thanked him, he said, "Mr. Boone showed me how." She smiled, but didn't answer. That name was beginning to echo. She found Caleb waiting outside that evening, not at the fence, but beside the steps, arms crossed, hat pulled low, as if he hadn't decided whether to speak or not. He didn't. He just handed her a small wooden box with a hand-carved lid. Inside, 4 glass bottles of ink, each a different shade. "Children will write better with proper tools," he said. That was all. She nodded. "They will, thank you." And for a moment he didn't leave. He stood there, awkward as a man trying to rebuild a barn with bare hands. "She's got your eyes," he said finally, voice rough, "but she holds her fists like mine." Mary Beth laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in months. Not politely, not out of necessity, a real, surprised laugh. Caleb stepped back. That's all. He left before she could say anything else. The following Sunday, Mary Beth did not attend church. but her name was mentioned in the closing prayer, not as a warning, but as part of the community. For Miss Taylor and her child, may they be strengthened. The preacher's voice didn't waver, but he paused just long enough for the meaning to land. No one responded, but no one objected. That evening, Mrs. Ellison left a bowl of stew on Mary Beth's doorstep at the boarding house. Covered, still warm. No note, just the gesture. And gestures mattered, because Redemption Ridge didn't apologize. It shifted, like ice cracking underfoot in March. Not loud, not fast, but permanent. Mary Beth continued teaching, her baby beside her in a bassinet made from Caleb's old chest, lined with scraps from Mrs. Langley's sewing basket. The children took turns watching the infant during lunch. They called her Baby Ruth, though no one could remember why. Mary Beth never corrected them. The child gurgled, smiled, waved her arms like flags, and something changed in the air. One day, Mary Beth stepped into the schoolhouse to find that someone, she didn't know who, had repaired the torn curtain. Same pattern, same cloth, but stitched clean, straight. Another day, someone left a box of apples. A week after that, fresh ink quills. By the time spring whispered promises across the hills, the town no longer spoke about Mary Beth in hushed tones. They said her name again, not with warmth, not yet, but with recognition. And recognition was the first step toward belonging. Caleb didn't return to the church or to town gatherings, but he came to the schoolhouse every Sunday evening, not for conversation, for the porch. He'd sit on the top step, drink from a flask of coffee, and whittle. Mary Beth never asked what he was carving, and he never showed her. But he always brought a piece of news. Fence behind the mercantiles come down. I'll mend it tomorrow. Blacksmith's wife had her baby boy. Saw your name in the ledger. Town council's renewing your contract. It was his way of speaking, not as gossip, but as reassurance, a weekly ledger of quiet stability. And Mary Beth listened. She didn't ask for more. She didn't need to, because when a man shows up every week, says little, brings something real, wood, apples, news, he is saying more than words ever could. One evening, after the baby had fallen asleep and the sun dipped low across the ridge, painting the horizon in honey and rust, Mary Beth asked him quietly, "Why me?" Caleb didn't look up. He just kept carving. Because you didn't flinch. That was all, and in Redemption Ridge that answer meant everything. The invitation came folded into her school ledger. It had no note, no name. Just a single sheet of thick ivory paper, tucked between the attendance roster and a lesson plan on homesteading. Memorial Sunday, scripture reading by Miss M. Taylor, Jeremiah 17:7-8. She stared at it for a long time. The handwriting was familiar. Reverend Palmer's old-fashioned cursive with firm, slanted loops. He had not spoken to her in weeks, not since the birth, not since the town meeting where he'd said nothing at all. Mary Beth read the verse silently. "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream." The irony didn't sting. It soothed. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in her satchel beside a worn cloth diaper and a half-stick of chalk. She didn't tell Caleb. She didn't ask anyone's opinion. But on the last Sunday of March, she dressed in her cleanest gown, pale blue with a pressed white collar, braided her hair into a neat crown, and carried her daughter to Redemption Ridge Chapel. The pews were packed. They always were on Memorial Sunday, when the town remembered those it had lost, in wars, in childbirth, in fire, in silence. The names were read aloud with ritual slowness, and the bell tolled once for each soul. This year, the room felt warmer than usual, The windows were steamed from the crowd, babies fussed, coats were peeled away, and still, when Mary Beth entered, heads turned. Not sharply, not with disdain, just turned. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her baby wrapped close to her chest in Caleb's old shawl, now lined with quilting squares from Mrs. Langley. The stitching was uneven, but the gesture had weight. She sat near the front, next to Millie's mother, who smiled, just barely, and shifted to make space. When Reverend Palmer called her name, the chapel grew still. No whispers, just waiting. Mary Beth stood and stepped up to the podium. She carried no Bible, only the verse, written out by hand on a piece of schoolhouse paper folded neatly in thirds. She unfolded it with calm fingers, placed it flat, and looked out over the pews. Not a soul met her gaze, not at first, but she didn't rush. She let the silence settle. And when she spoke, her voice was low and steady, like water moving under ice. Blessed is the one who trusts. Her eyes didn't rise, her hands didn't tremble. Who does not fear when heat comes, whose leaves are always green. Each word fell like a seed on tilled soil. The chapel breathed in together. A child coughed, a shoe scuffed against wood, then stillness again. They will have no worries in a year of drought and never fail to bear fruit. She finished, folded the paper. She did not bow. She did not curtsy. She returned to her seat without fanfare. But in that moment, something shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but real. Mrs. Whitcomb, seated near the back, leaned toward her husband and whispered something. He said nothing in return. The mayor nodded once when Mary Beth passed him on her way out. Reverend Palmer didn't say thank you, but he looked at her and didn't look away. And most telling of all, when she stepped outside into the sunlit yard, the little church bell still ringing in the breeze, no one turned their back. The week that followed felt changed, though no one would admit it. People lingered after school. Sarah's father offered to fix the schoolhouse windows. Henry's mother brought a pot of soup and left it without knocking. Children from families who once crossed the street when Mary Beth walked by now approached her with questions about homework, the baby, the next spelling test. The air, for the first time since she'd arrived, didn't press against her skin like judgment. It felt open, and Caleb noticed. He came by that Friday with a new cedar board for the porch step. They spoke little as he worked, his hammer tapping in rhythm with a sparrow's call from the nearby pine. When he was done, he didn't leave right away. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket. A thin carved strip of wood, flat, smooth, sanded at the edges. He handed it to her. She turned it over. One word had been etched in bold, patient letters, rooted. Her fingers curled around it slowly. "I heard your reading," he said quietly. "I was standing outside. You should have come in." He shrugged. Didn't need to. They stood in silence for a while. The baby stirred in her arms, then settled again. Finally, Mary Beth spoke. "You know, I think the town's starting to breathe again." Caleb didn't smile, but something in his shoulders softened. "It ain't about the town." She raised an eyebrow. "It's about you. You breathed first. They just followed." That Sunday, the church bell rang again. Same rhythm, same sound. But this time, when Mary Beth passed through the yard, several voices called her name. Some smiled. One little girl reached for her baby's hand. Mary Beth smiled back. Not because she was forgiven, but because she had never asked to be. She had simply stayed. And in Redemption Ridge, staying, with grace, without apology, was the loudest sermon anyone could preach. Spring arrived like a secret. First, in the melting snow that carved soft rivers through the edge of town. Then, in the gold-green buds that clung to the cottonwoods beside the chapel. Then, in the songs, tentative, bird-thin, hidden in the eaves of the schoolhouse. And then one morning, it was just there. Undeniable, warm and alive, like a promise kept. The town thawed with it. The blacksmith opened his windows. Children played marbles again on the dusty stretch behind the post office. Garden plots were cleared. Wash lines bloomed with dresses and quilts. For the first time in months, the people of Redemption Ridge didn't walk fast to avoid the cold. They walked slow to feel the sun. Mary Beth felt it in her bones. She felt it in the way the breeze moved through her window as she graded spelling tests. She felt it in the coos of her baby, now chubby and bright-eyed, who loved to watch the light shift across the schoolroom walls. And she felt it in the silence that had once accused, now quiet, yes, but no longer cruel. Just peace. So when the mayor announced a spring fair, the first since before the war, no one scoffed, no one protested. The field behind the church was cleared. A platform was built. Musicians practiced on porches. Bunting was strung between lampposts and fence posts, and children painted signs in school, "May dance, this Saturday." Mary Beth was asked to bake a pie for the judging table. She was also asked, gently but firmly, to help lead the children's performance of America the Beautiful. She accepted both without pause. The fair bloomed under a sky so blue it almost felt staged. Tables of preserves, ribbons, old rifles displayed with reverence. Laughter rang out beside the cornbread. Someone roasted apples over a fire pit. Toddlers chased each other in dizzy circles. Caleb Boone stood near the blacksmith's booth, arms folded, watching without watching. Mary Beth wore a soft green dress, not new, but freshly hemmed. The baby, dressed in yellow muslin, nestled in a sling against her chest. People greeted her now, by name. They asked about the child. They complimented her students. No one brought up the winter. No one needed to. As the sun dipped low and the band struck its first waltz, Mary Beth found herself standing near the edge of the gathering, not quite apart, but not quite within. Then she saw him, Caleb, not at a distance, not near the edge, but walking straight toward her. He wore a clean shirt, his boots were polished, he held out a hand, not formally, not theatrically, just open. "You never danced at the chapel socials," he said. She tilted her head, amused. "Wasn't much for dancing." "Me neither." A pause. "But I figure neither of us has had much use for what was," she smiled, the kind of smile that rises from somewhere quiet and earned. She handed her daughter to Sarah's mother, who beamed with pride as she took the child into her arms, and Mary Beth placed her hand in his. They moved slowly. No crowd gathered, no applause came, but the music carried them, soft, rhythmic, old and forgiving. Caleb's hand at her waist was steady. Her steps didn't falter. They moved like two trees swaying in the same wind. Someone whispered, "Look," but no one stared. Because what they were seeing wasn't spectacle. It was the culmination of something much gentler. Recognition. Mary Beth rested her cheek near Caleb's shoulder. Not out of romance, out of rest. She had fought long enough, and now she was held, not rescued. The dance ended. They didn't bow, they didn't speak, but as they stood together on the edge of the crowd, the baby asleep nearby, laughter echoing through the dusk, they felt it. The shift, the completion. The town, in its imperfect way, had embraced them, not because it forgot, but because it remembered differently now. Later, long after the booths were cleared and the fires burned low, Mary Beth sat on the schoolhouse steps, her child asleep in her lap, Caleb beside her, whittling again. They didn't talk about the dance. They didn't talk about what would come next. But as the stars blinked alive overhead and the wind rustled the new leaves, Mary Beth looked out across the ridge. this town that had tried to break her. And she saw not rejection, but home, because she never fought to be loved, she fought to be seen. And now, under lantern light and starlight and the soft hush of belonging, she finally was.